Good morning, everyone. This is Doug, and we are doing part 2 or episode 2 of Paulianity book review. And I have good news. Some of you maybe complained or did something. It suddenly is back on Kindle. So 3 or 4 people told me it was off of Kindle. I went and double checked Amazon. It was no longer available. And then 2 days later, there it is, 9/16. It's available. So you can grab it now. It may be gone if you don't do that. But anyway, it's just a few dollars now. But we're going to see that this episode we're going to be a little critical here of this book because I think he is indulging in something that is damaging to his point of view. In other words, it's going to backfire because it looks like we're participating in deception ourselves when we try to defend Paul's actions in Acts is the only truth about Paul's nature, because there we see a person who endorses the law, that teaches works worthy of repentance, and does everything in front of Luke that would make Luke think Paul is law compliant, and did the same thing to James in chapter 21. So that's what he's going to rely upon. Now, it's useful, though, for us to see this presentation. I'm going to present it to you because, number one, it does help prove how deceptive Paul actually really is as a human being, that he would do that. And then we're going to prove to you the truth as Paul defends hypocrisy and a false face in order to advance the gospel. And he doesn't just say it once, twice. He says it multiple times, at least 4 times. So, or at least his actions with Timothy, I believe, constitutes a 4th time, where he circumcises Timothy even though he said that circumcision will sever you from Christ. That's what he does with Timothy in order to placate Jewish people who thought, Timothy couldn't go around uncircumcised in certain places. Anyway, so let me give you the subheading. The subtext heading here is Paul's two-faced hypocrisy with Luke and James is ignored by Farrell. And instead, he gullibly uses it to make an argument. And again, if we become a partaker of deception ourselves, we become deceivers. We have to make sure we're not actually relying upon evidence that was designed to mislead Luke himself and the church and the 12, which is seemingly actually the case. So that's, but again, it's a good review of how you would prove how far Paul went to deceive Luke, and then tie it together with Paul's passages in Romans and in Corinthians and his actions with Timothy, all to and in with also with James, to prove Paul's depths to which he won't go in order to deceive people, that he is a law compliant person when in fact he is totally the opposite. Okay, and we're also going to review all the passages about Paul's own defense of using hypocrisy, pretense, and lying for the gospel. He defends all of these things. And we'll get to that later. This is what we're going to talk about later is Paul's self-avowed hypocritical tactics to gain followers. So we'll get into that later. But now we're going to go look at Farrell. All right, so our heading for the introduction to Farrell's material is Farrell believes Paul's good faith, but really Farrell is proving how Paul deceived or attempted to deceive Luke. So all this evidence is useful for us when you do this, I believe, in the correct way, which is you don't become a partaker in deception by accepting something that is obviously misleading and false. So everything that we're seeing in the book of Acts, he's taking as Paul's true face instead of what we can see when we compare it to his written epistles. That gives a different face. So there's 2 faces to Paul, the one that Luke can see and the one that we can all see now that we see the writings that Luke did not have any knowledge about, as scholars all concur, because he couldn't say all the things he's saying and showing about Paul without himself being a deceiver. See, that's the whole thing. That's how you know Luke didn't have any of these epistles, because he couldn't have, with a straight face, have given us the book of Acts, or at least if it's an appellate brief, as the experts say it is, that would be, it still would be hard to imagine he would just leave out all the truth of Paul's epistles and hope to pretend that everything that Paul's behavior in front of him was the real Paul. But I digress. Anyway, let's see what he says here. At the risk of getting sidetracked in too much doctrine, Christians will often quote Paul's other teachings, which claim things like the law is a form of bondage, and condemn anyone who tries to keep it as meaning that Paul believes the law is done away with. So he's acknowledging that there's something out there, but he never wants to talk about it. He doesn't want to quoted, at least at this juncture. He doesn't want to cite any of it. He doesn't want to create you any doubt in your mind of where he's going. And that's, I honestly feel you have to show both sides of a coin right up front, and then tell people how you interpret these two sets of evidence. Don't give them one view without simultaneously acknowledging there's another view and then dealing with that as you're trying to prove your points. Okay. Now, he says this, but again, Christians are likely misunderstanding Paul's original intent. So he is actually siding with the idea that what you see in Luke's Acts is the real Paul, and that's his real intent. But what we read in his epistles, we're just going to disregard give weight to Luke, who's what is he? He's a hearsay recorder of Paul, who's more authentic than Luke about Paul's true views. It has to be Paul's own writings, not Luke's impression of somebody who we can show you is willing to do deception. And we'll get into that in a second. All right, now, Farrell continues. So he says, it is my belief that Paul's early teachings were that you cannot earn your salvation from keeping the law, for the law is impossible to keep. Okay, so right away, the law says, what did John say? I just did this in the prior episode, 1 John 5. It's not too difficult to keep, but Paul's teaching the opposite of John, Apostle John. So just a footnote there. Now, that is not to say that one should not even try to keep the law, for the law is good. Okay, so he's, I think, interjecting his own point of view. Again, that's a big difference. Rather, Paul's suggesting that if a person attempts to earn salvation by keeping some law, that they will fail because no one can keep it fully, according to Paul. I'll examine Paul's statements against the law more closely in chapters to come. Okay, so he's believing, though, that this is the real deal. Paul's original intent is misunderstood. Now, I mean, I'm going to go through with you just an overview of what he's talking about. So the Sabbath day. So why would you believe that Paul believes in the Sabbath when he says in Romans 14 that, the strong in faith know there's no difference between any day. There's no special day to consider, but the weak in faith, they take concern about a special day. But let every man be convinced in his own mind. Make it up on your own. What is there a special day of the week or not? No, it's all a matter of what you want to believe. That's what he says in Romans 14. So you can't get away from this stuff. And he twice in other places abolishes the Sabbath, like in Colossians and also in Romans, as I've just read to you. Now, how does he prove keeping the Sabbath? Does he use Paul's own writings? No, he uses Luke. We also know that Paul attended synagogues regularly even after his conversion and did so on the Sabbath per the requirements of the law, not instituting a new day of worship on Sunday, as some like to claim. Here are just a few of the 85 times recorded in the book of Acts alone where the new believers are observing the Sabbath. Okay, so he's just showing you that is the new believer pattern, which matches Acts 15, by the way, where, and I think it's verse 24 and 25, James says for the Gentiles, he's given these 4 laws, and he says for the Gentiles, for the laws read every week at Sabbath meetings. And so he's basically saying that I'll leave them to learn more as they go along gradually. I'm not just going to bomb them with a whole bunch of stuff now. Here are just a few of the 85 times recorded in the book of Acts alone where the new believers are observing the Sabbath. I selected some specifically where Paul was there. Okay, so he's really saying, here's evidence of Paul's behavior. Therefore, what he's doing in front of Luke is honest and from his heart, that he believes Shabbat is when you rest. And so he's going to cite Acts 17, 1-2, 3 Sabbaths. As Paul's custom, he went to them for 3 Sabbaths. So for 3 straight Sabbaths, he goes and he evangelizes Gentiles, a synagogue of Jews. He evangelizes them. So he is using this of evidence as Paul's true intent. No, this is actually proof, as we'll see when we read Paul's actual writings, that this is his proof of fraud on Luke, because he'll act. According to 1 Corinthians 9, he'll act like he's obedient to the law when he's around those who are under the law. But when he's around those who don't believe in the law, he'll act like he's not under the law. See? So he just goes by the belief of the people he's with. He's going to put on a false face for whoever he's with, because he believes that's how he's going to save souls. Then Farrell provides you this citation from Acts 13:13-15. Same thing. The evidence is only what Paul let Luke see, not what Paul really believes. So now Paul and his companions put out to sea from Paphos. John left them and returned to Jerusalem. But going on from Perga, they arrived at Pisidian Antioch. And on the Sabbath day, they went into the synagogue and sat down. After reading the law and the prophets, the synagogue officials sent to them, saying, "Brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say it." So, yeah, Paul is pretending to care about the Sabbath because he's trying to evangelize people, but he doesn't. He's going to, if his message resonates in long term and Luke's not around to overhear him and then report back to the 12 apostles and James, he's going to have a different message than what he's going to say in front of Luke's eyes and ears. Then it just talks about another passage. Where is that? This is Acts 13. I guess this is just a continuation a little bit later in Acts 13. People kept begging that these things might be spoken to them the next Sabbath. So people wanted to hear from him next Sabbath. And so that is the proof again that this is only what Paul is allowing Luke to hear. Again, because 1 Corinthians 9 tells us Paul is okay with putting on a false face in front of someone who thinks the law applies when, in fact, you don't believe the law applies. We'll show you that later, immediately after this review. The New Testament records that Paul also observed the so-called Jewish festivals, such as the Feast of the Weeks. Some of these are a bit of a stretch, but that's okay. Paul also insisted that his disciple Timothy be circumcised per the Jewish law. Is absolutely correct, and this is one of the biggest proofs that he is a fraud, because how can he say that you're circumcised from? He says in Galatians in chapter 5, he says, if you get circumcised, you have severed yourself from Christ, and that yet he's circumcising Timothy. Why? To placate the Jews. Exactly what Paul said. You can't do it for righteousness' sake, to appear righteous. You just have to not be circumcised. And if you do, you're severed from Christ. Yet Paul, personally circumcised Timothy years after he wrote that in Galatians. Paul said, and all of this is as it should be. For if, as modern Christianity now asserts, Paul taught that the law was done away with and had no value, then he would certainly be in contradiction of the teachings of all God's prophets of old and all the other apostles before him, and even of Jesus himself. Yes, that's the actual truth. That's all true. So, but what he's saying is if you don't accept his explanation, then you are agreeing that Paul is in contradiction to all God's prophets, to Jesus and the apostles. And but Farrell has to understand the Paulinists know Paul contradicts Jesus. They know he contradicts the law. They know he contradicts all the prophets. They don't, but they don't have any rule of apostasy in their heads. They're told that Paul came with a completely new dispensation from a Christ who descended, who's communicating to him in the third heaven, but he can't repeat anything that his Jesus is saying to him. That's where he explains that in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 3-6. And that's why they can accept him. They compartmentalize the law, the prophets, and Jesus away from Paul, that he can remain valid despite he contradicts everything that comes before him. He contradicts Yahweh, he contradicts Jesus. That isn't enough for them. They've created this little world, this little island, which unfortunately 99% of Christianity now has moved into this little island that's going to sink into the ocean on the end of time and Judgment Day. And that's where they're all standing right now, unfortunately. The New Testament records Jesus saying about the law. Okay, we'll move on from that. For the moment, I will give Paul the benefit of the doubt and say that it is a modern Christianity that has simply misinterpreted a few of the more difficult things to understand in Paul's teachings. Again, he's totally relied upon only Luke's impression of what he's been allowed to see, a completely false face when you compare it to Paul's epistles. Okay, now Farrell does give you a little idea that he's aware of another possibility, that Paul's lying. Let's read that. He says, let's start from the beginning here. For the moment, I will give Paul the benefit of the doubt and say that it is modern Christianity that has simply misinterpreted a few of the more difficult things to understand in Paul's teachings, but we'll dig into the possibility that Paul was actually a liar a little later on. So that he's saying it's a possibility, but he's told you already multiple times he doesn't believe. He believes Paul. He believes that what he's saying and doing in front of Luke is not a put on, not a con job, but instead, and James, by the way, in Acts 21, where Paul obeys something that James asked him to do, which is, Farrell's going to actually bring that up as proof positive that Paul's law compliant, because Paul did exactly what James told him to do under the law. So anyway, he's going to get to it, and I'm not going to cover it in this episode, what he says. I'm just saying right now he's put his foot in it. And I want to put a little pin over here and say, if this was something I was writing today, and I still wanted to bring this to your attention, I would say, hypothetically, if you're a Paulinist and you believe in Paul, why is he doing all these behaviors in the book of Acts where he's teaching works worthy of repentance? And works worthy of repentance is his gospel. He tells Agrippa, this is the message I bring to the Gentile, a gospel of works worthy of repentance. That's in Acts 26 under oath. Obviously, it's a court proceeding. So he is lying. If you believe his gospels or his epistles are his true words, then he lied to King Agrippa. So you're gonna have quandaries like that. So if you believe in Paul, you have to accept, hypothetically, if you believe in Paul in the book of Acts, then you have to accept the things he said, what Paul himself said. And then they'll be in dissonance. That's true. They'll be in dissonance. But on the other hand, if you know this is false, just make sure you made clear that it's hypothetical. Hypothetically, let's assume what you believe. It's a good argument, actually, to take something that the people who are resisting following Jesus Christ alone as a sole teacher, sole pastor, instead of with Paul hanging on and having superiority. You want to get them there. The good way to get them there is it could be to use these arguments of Farrell, but differently, and say, assuming what you believe, how do you deal with Acts, where Paul has all these different statements? He twice says he believes in all the law and prophets. He doesn't say that in Galatians 4:3. He says the Torah was given by angels through a mediator, and he refers to them in Galatians 4:9 as weak and beggarly celestial beings, according to Vincent. That's the correct translation, he says. So anyway, let's move on. I just want to show you more of what he has to say. Okay, and then he says, an historian, physician, and personal friend of Paul's, known in the Bible simply as Luke, records in the book of Acts that Paul was received gladly by the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, and documents that Paul appeared before James and all the other elders to give testimony of the things he was preaching and the things that were being done among the Gentiles. Luke records in Acts 21, verses 17 to 20, that the Jewish elders in Jerusalem glorified God and referred to Paul as a brother, stating specifically, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. Please notice they did not call him an apostle, everybody. Please notice that, because he's never called an apostle by anybody but in Paul's own epistles. Luke does say the word apostle, by the way, means messenger. So Luke does mention that Paul is a messenger from the church of Antioch to go to Jerusalem to ask this question that the church had about circumcision. But there, the word apostle is not being used in the sense of a name or title, but simply actually the function he was of a messenger along with Barnabas. I digress. All right. So the Jewish elders referred to Paul as brother, saying specifically, you see, brother, how many thousands there are. It's tens of thousands, by the way. There are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. So here's a good moment for Christians, Pauline Christians, to be asked, what is the early church doing? They're being zealous for the law, and yet Paul is not getting the message. And this has gone on now. This is around 51, 52, 53 AD. Paul's been at this for 20 some odd years, but of that, 14 years he was away in Arabia, and we don't know what he was doing. So he's really only been involved in the church for a short period of time. And these are these ventures that is recorded in the book of Acts, primarily with Luke. But I digress. In other words, the Jewish leadership admitted that many believers in Jesus were still zealous for the law, as was Paul. Paul's not zealous for the law until you can prove he's zealous for the law, that is sincere. And that's clearly in doubt. He even has doubts, not all, but he thinks he's solved them somehow. We'll go into that later. But the problem is that he is not factoring in Paul's statements about justifying putting on a false face of being law compliant around people who believe the law still exists. Originally, therefore, we see evidence that the elders of the Jewish community believe Paul was observant to the law. No, they actually test him. They've heard rumors that he's an apostate, and they then give him a test to prove otherwise, to prove that he is law compliant. So if they thought he was law compliant, they didn't need to give him a test, right? If they had seen him obeying God's word and law regularly and from sincere belief and actions, they wouldn't even have given him this test. But they're going to give him a test that he's got to prove that he's law compliant, as I will discuss. But they give him the Nazarite vow, but he's going to go into it. And actually, it starts right here. Farrell continues. Furthermore, Luke records in Acts 21, verse 17, that Paul also assisted the other new converts to the way in completing the Nazarite vow with them. You see, when visiting Jerusalem, the Jewish elders were concerned because Paul was being accused by some of his fellow Jews of teaching new converts to disobey the law. The elders then provided a solution to Paul, proved to everyone that he keeps the law by completing the Nazarite vow with some of the new converts. And this is exactly what Paul did, as recorded here. I'll examine this more carefully here, as we will be returning to this selection in chapters to come as well. Now, this is where Paul should have told James his true opinion is that law is no more. But he didn't, and he's just silent. But let's keep reading this context. So Farrell's quoting now for the book of Acts. After these days, we got ready and started on our way. We, as Luke and Paul, got ready and started on our way up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea also came with us, taking us to Mnason of Cyprus, a disciple of long standing, with whom we were to lodge. After we arrived in Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly, and the following day Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. Presumably the apostles were among them. After he had greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. This is Paul talking. Paul is talking to the Gentiles, and Luke is recording, summarizing. And when they heard it, they began glorifying God. And they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands, tens of thousands is the word, there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. And they have been told about you that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses." False, false, false. It's the word apostasy. You can see it in Mount Seas. That's a cognate term, meaning you just have to turn that into English, apostasy, and you know exactly the same meaning. Why would you change it to the word forsake? Just to hide it, because everybody would know it's a very criminal act under the law. It's a death penalty under the law if this is true. And that's in Deuteronomy 13, 1-10. Among the Gentiles to apostatize against Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you've come. So these are the people who've made these accusations, will have heard that Paul's come, and they're there present at this time. And James is going to give Paul the command to do something, and that is to take a Nazarite vow and pay for the costs of other proselytes who are doing the same thing at the same time. And Paul simply agrees, does not say, I don't believe in the law. The law was given by angels, not by God. Yahweh was given by weak and celestial beings. And why do you, James, want to be in bondage to that weak and beggarly angels again? So he doesn't say any of that, right? So he is what? Putting on a false face. Now, that's where I'm going to now stop and pause, and I'm going to do a sub-teaching here to show you what Farrell has to realize. What he's done here is taken a position that would make him an agent of fraud himself, of deception, because this is not Paul's true face. And he even admits these tactics in his epistles. And that explains exactly why we're seeing this very truncated, very law-compliant Paul in front of Luke, because Luke is obviously connected to the leadership of the church. That's why he's been commissioned in the first place to write the book of Luke using the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew that's sitting in Caesarea. That's a thing that only a few privileged people, the Ebion, the early church, would ever permit anyone to get near. They had to get permission at this library. You could go in and then make your own copy or do a translation. And that's what Luke's doing. He's a Latin speaker, but he knows Greek, and he translated, and he also knows Hebrew, and he translated from Hebrew into Greek. That's who he was, and he did this as part of an appellate brief for the magistrate assistant to Nero named Theophilus, and that's what's pending at the end of Acts, is this appeal at Rome. Paul is actually waiting for the appeal in Rome when it acts, and it's at the end of Acts, and it's 2 years later that the appeal takes place, and Paul is actually acquitted, according to both Jerome and Eusebius, in that particular appeal. So now I'm going to show you what Farrell and anyone has to know, that you cannot rely upon this evidence in the way it's being presented as if it's true, as if you could believe it, as if it were credible, meaning that Paul is a law-compliant person for real. I'm going to start with the most important passage for knowing how Paul views being honest or dishonest for the gospel. And this is entitled, Paul's Self-Avowed Hypocritical Tactics to Gain Followers. Paul taught us the example to accommodate Gentiles when around Gentiles and to act like a Jew around Jews, to save some. Quote, This is 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 to 22 in the King James Bible. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, as without law. So he's going to act as if he's without law when he's around Gentiles. It means he's going to disregard the law. Let's say food laws, eating meat sacrificed to idols, all kinds of pernicious, abominable things, right? That I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. That is the rule of hypocrisy. If I were to give you a command to be a hypocrite, this is exactly what I would tell you to do. This is just amazing that he has no self-awareness, I think, sometimes of what he's saying. But anyway, here we go. Next quote. This is 1 Corinthians 10, 31, verses 31 to 33, King James Version. Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, and they may be saved. Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. My goodness, there was no guile in Christ, so this is ridiculous. Imitating Christ would be the opposite of doing what Paul does, obviously. Now, I want to back up here and give us some spiritual anchoring that we know how to measure what Paul's doing. Is it okay? Is it okay to lie for the gospel? A good introductory point to this topic is Proverbs 12, verse 10 in the NIV, which says, quote, "The Lord condemns a crafty man." We read similarly in Psalm 5, verse 6, "Deceitful men the Lord abhors." And finally, quote, "Cursed is he who does the work of the Lord Yahweh deceitfully." Jeremiah 48, verse 10. And then compare Revelation 14, verse 5. "And in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God." These were the Christians. These are the Christians who, when Christ came, uh, when the sickle's going down and taking out the evil, what remained were the righteous. Of course, Paul doesn't believe there's anybody righteous, but that's a whole other thing. What kind of teacher was Paul? By his own admission, did Paul ever say he used deceit or guile and used craftiness to capture disciples? We shall see. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12:16, this is the quote. It's from the ASV, American Standard Version, 1901. "But be it so, I did not myself burden you, but being crafty, I caught you with guile." A similar end justifies the means attitude by Paul toward lying for the gospel is found here in Romans 3, verse 7, King James Version. "For if the truth of God has more abounded through my lie unto his glory, why yet am I also judged as a sinner?" Philippians, we read something very similar in 1 verse 18. "What then? Only then in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice. Yes, I will rejoice." The Infinite Truth Project ably comments on this particular verse in Philippians. "Forgiving all his sins prior to self-proclaimed conversion, let us ponder on the philosophy on which Paul preached." In Philippians chapter 1, verse 18, "But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this I rejoice." End of quote. Paul clearly does not care if you go by evil means to spread the message of Christ, so long as the people hear of Christ. This is the article "Paul, Apostle or Heretic" in the Infinite Truth Project from March of 2016. Then they're going to give an example of such pretense, and they give this one. This is on Timothy being circumcised. I mentioned this earlier. "And as a teacher, Paul showed some of his own hypocrisy while keeping in mind Paul's attitude towards circumcision found in Romans 2, verse 25 to 27, 1 Corinthians 7, verses 17 to 20, Galatians 5, verse 2 to 4, and Galatians 6, 12 to 15. We can see that Paul himself circumcised Timothy, Acts 16:3, even though Christ would profit him nothing, Galatians 5:2. Even Jerome in the 400s raised Paul's action with Timothy as proof of the very same, quote, deceitful dissimulation that Paul accused Peter of in Galatians. This quote below is Jerome's words. This is from Agenor Etienne Gasparin, a book of 1854. He says, Jerome wrote this: "O Paul, why then did you cause Timothy to be circumcised contrary to your own convictions? I ask you again, Paul, why did you shave your head?" This is the Acts 21 episode where James demands him to do this Nazarite vow. "We've thus seen that for fear of the Jews, Paul pretended that he observed the precepts of the law." So Paul is definitely spot on being observed by Jerome as being deceitful for the good of the gospel, of course. And I'm going to skip over a few things I had prepared, but I want to show you that a form of argumentation that was known it was called Neologisms in the era of communism. They would talk out of seemingly self-contradictory terms. Slavery is freedom and things like that. And so to just basically redefine terms so that crazy contradictions are no longer contradictory, and it causes internal dissonance in the listener, and they don't realize what's happening is someone is deconstructing their values. Okay, so instead of slavery being a bad thing, it's freedom. See, so and it seems contradictory, right? It's the opposite. The words no longer have meaning if that's true. But that was a actual phrase of some of the communists in the 50s. Okay. So anyway, listen to this. This is exactly that, a neologism or a statement that's self-contradictory, and by redefining terms, the only way it can be reasoned, the only way you can understand it is if you allow the terms to be redefined. So listen to this. Romans 2:6-7. Paul affirms unquestionably the key component that good works plays in salvation, as Jesus taught the rich young ruler in Matthew's gospel. And in Jesus' statement, quote, every tree without good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Matthew 7:19. Is good works required according to Jesus? Absolutely. Because if you don't have it, where are you going? You're going to the fire. Oh, I didn't want to read that verse, Doug. Why did you have to read that verse to me? I'm a Paulinist. I don't want to hear Jesus say things that are contrary to Paul. Well, you got to listen, because your salvation yourself has to be determined whether you're going to be challenged and test Paul in light of the words of Jesus. And that's all you need to see. Watch this. So Paul's going to say the same things as Jesus here in Romans 3:7, 2:6-7, excuse me, Romans 2 verses 6-7. God will render to every man according to his deeds, to those who by patient continuance in well-doing, erga agatha, so they hid the words there, it's good works. Everybody who knows Greek knows that. Erga is works, agatha is good, but it's hidden. You can't see it. Now, let's see what else he says just a couple of chapters later. In a short span, Paul will take that all back. The most emphatic is Romans 4, verses 3-5, which was a key passage upon which Luther built the faith alone without works doctrine. Paul says this, for what says the scripture? Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. Again, that's a mistranslation. Just go take a look at Genesis 15:6 in the King James. Abraham believed God and counted it to him for righteousness. Who's the subject of counted? The same as the subject of believed. Abraham believed and counted it to God as a righteous thing to have made a promise in the prior verse to give him a son in old age. Paul was looking at or mistranslated it, or was looking at the Septuagint, and he changed the subject to it. But I digress. Continuing. Now to him that works is the reward not reckoned of grace, but of debt. Oh, so if you have to do, God says in Exodus 20, verse 6, after the first commandment, he says, I extend mercy to those who love me and obey my commandments. That's earning salvation, according to Paul. So the only way to have mercy in the future, which is synonymous with grace, is you have to not work for it. You have to do nothing for it. Else it's not really grace. It's something you have to earn. He's saying grace can't ever be earned, but grace is earned. That's what it means. It's favor. You can earn favor with God by doing what he tells you to do. But he's redefining terms. These are neologisms, exactly what communism in its early rhetoric used. This kind of, redefine the term. Redefine grace as unearned when it means earned favor. And I've showed you that in the passage about Jesus, uses the word grace 4 times, and it's hidden from you, but it's right there in the book of Luke. Let's continue. But to him that works not, you don't have works, you don't have any good works, no erga agatha, which he said saves you in Romans 2, verse 6 and 7, right? But you believe on him that justifies the ungodly. And just so you know, God says, I will never justify the ungodly. Ungodly means an unrepentant, wicked person. God says, I will never justify an ungodly person. Yet here he's contradicting Yahweh again. Unbelievable. His faith is counted for righteousness. So this is based completely on a mistranslation of Genesis 15:6 to say that it was counted to him for righteousness. That's not the subject of the word counted. It was Abraham, counted the promise of God as a righteous deed of God towards him. This is how backwards he is, and he doesn't even know how to translate Hebrew. And the King James gets the Hebrew right. Get that. King James has a conflicting version of how to translate this same verse that Paul's quoting from, and they get it right. But I digress. How do Paulinists reconcile this obvious use of guile between Romans 2:7 and Romans 4:5? We read one example. Good works please God, Romans 2:7, and yet they are not faith, Romans 4:5. So what he's saying is, yeah, good works get you to heaven, but it's only to please God, and God was going to send you to heaven without your works. So he's rewriting. This is what communist neologism makes you do too. You redefine slavery as freedom. So whenever they want to put more bondage on you or more censorship or whatever, this just gives us a more free society. And you are brainwashed to think you're being made free and more free the more there's controls and censorship and dictatorship and gulags and all that. That's more freedom when it's actually slavery. But you've been convinced by doctrine, by repetition over and over again that it's actually freedom. That slavery is freedom. Do you see the point? And actually, it's very similar to Paul. Paul teaches that the law is bondage. And if you obey the law, you're in bondage to it. And he's saying your freedom is to get away from the law. It's exactly the same thing of the communist neologism of freedom and slavery. The same thing. He's doing the same. I would just simply say the early communist rhetoricians used this same technique of the same words that Paul was doing. Bondage, slavery, same thing. Slavery is freedom. You just have to redefine terms, and now you can create a dissonance in the listener, and they are more likely to be susceptible to your propaganda. And that's exactly what Paul's doing in his epistles. And look how look how systematically the churches all around you all are soaked in this doctrine now, at least in the United States. None of us really know what's going on in the rest of the world because we're in a echo chamber here in the United States. But that in our country, we know 99% of everybody believes that Paul is the guy, and Paul is teaching us faith alone, and that we're better off, we're free, when actually we're now set on path to be slaves of sin. Jesus said to become a disciple of his was necessary in John 8. The believers in him, who are Jews, Jesus said, now next to you need to become free by becoming my disciples. They said, we've never been in bondage to anyone. He says, well, when you're in bondage to sin, Jesus says, when you're sinning, you're in bondage to you're a slave of sin. And he says, so if you follow me, become my disciples, you will be free indeed. And so they get angry at him. They want to kill him, Jesus says. And then Jesus basically says, you're sons of the devil. You now want to kill me. That's how fast people went from faith alone. That's all they had. And they didn't want to be a disciple, and they disobeyed Jesus, and they didn't become his disciples. And now he's telling them they're sons of the devil. That's how fast it took. Just read that. It'll blow your mind that the people who were supposedly believers should have been saved. And they did. It says so. They were believed. And they were obedient and to Christ until he asked them to do something they didn't want to do. And that's exactly what most Christians do today, 99% of them. So anyway, God bless everybody. So that's part 2 of Farrell. And next time we're going to examine where he ventures to discuss whether Paul was a liar or not. And let's see how he resolves that. All right. So look for episode 3 probably tomorrow. God bless. Ciao.